Hello everyone, this video lesson will be on comparing China and Europe in their Renaissance periods. We often understand Europe is going through a Renaissance, but I think it is fair to argue that China is also going through a Renaissance after the occupation period of Mongol rule. Make sure that you have viewed the Medieval Europe video lesson as well as the crash course on Venetian merchants beforehand, so this all makes better sense. All right, let's start with China. So the recovery period after the fall of the Mongolian Empire is the Ming Dynasty. And remember that the Mongols fall from power mostly because they expanded their territories too far, and slowly groups are gaining more autonomy on their own. But ultimately, it has everything to do with the plague. The plague rips through their whole empire, weakens everything enough that it does allow for multiple groups to rise up, including the Ming family, to rise up and ultimately topple the Mongols and any of the other competing families that were seeking the mandate of heaven. And the ultimate goal of the Ming Dynasty is to make China Chinese again. That we had this, over 100-year period in which the Mongols ruled. And as much as the Mongols did support much Chinese culture, it was still a period of occupation, right, which ultimately hits at a sense of nationalism, and some Chinese culture was stifled, right, because Confucianism was not as valued by the Mongols, but now China's back, right? We are led by ethnically Chinese people. And so we see this idea of celebrating that the Chinese have their territories back in so many facets of the Ming Dynasty. So we'll ban all things Mongolian, including Mongolian names, and we'll bring back all things Confucian, like to the next level. Also, as we'll see, we see a serious economic revival, improved agriculture, so a lot more food production, even better printing, so our education is through the roof. And also this is artistically another Renaissance period. Improvements in porcelain, we're writing more than ever. And also China really leaves its own borders by creating its first super successful and large-scale navy under the Admiral Zheng He. So we'll get to him just a minute. So this is the extent of the Ming Empire. So they have taken all those territories back from the Mongols. And Hong Wu is our first main emperor of the Ming Dynasty. He will not only solidify power under the Ming, but also restore a lot of Chinese political traditions. We'll bring back the Confucian civil service exam, and just as we see with every dynasty, one way to show how Confucian you are and that your dynasty is better than the previous ones is by making that civil service exam even more impossible. So it's said that the Ming Dynasty exams were really, really difficult. We're going to heavily centralize the government again using the exams and giving even more power to the elite governing class, which become known as the mandarins. And the vast majority of the mandarins, almost at every level, will be eunuchs. So this practice has been around for a while, and we have discussed it before. But remember that the Chinese will insist that anyone who has any level of power within its government and that is not related to the imperial family, that they give up their ability to produce a family, right, by becoming eunuchs. And this process could mean simply removing or destroying the capacity of the testicles. Some of the eunuchs completely lost their penises altogether. So this is showing a severe level of commitment, and families would often decide to eunuch at least one of the sons of their family, keep one to pass on the family name, but the one that they expected to attend the universities, to become a civil servant or a general or anything like that, would have been eunuched at a young age, right? So that as much power as they got, they could never fully contest the dynasty because they had no family with which they could contest them, right? You need a family, you need inheritors in order to be a dynasty. Thus, they insisted this. So, unprecedented levels of eunuchs and mandarins all working within the Chinese government. And in this age of economic and cultural revival, we see massive public works projects. So, we will use conscripted labor, which often leads to rebellions on the part of the peasants. And there will be some minor ones, but no major ones, because this is an era of nationalism. Like the Chinese are proud to have their nation back. So we will use conscripted labor to do things like rebuild the Great Wall, which was obviously toppled by the Mongols, to build other types of infrastructure, and also to build the Forbidden City, which we'll take a look at in just a minute. Also, in terms of trade, this is an era when everyone's trying to get to China. So, as we'll see, Europe is embarking on its age of quote unquote discovery, which is kind of a garbage term because everyone knew where everything was except for the Europeans. But the Europeans will now make it a goal to have more sustained trade with China, and that's because this is like the pinnacle of Chinese trade. We're still trading silk. Their porcelains are more famous than ever. The Ming Era porcelain is that blue and white porcelain, amongst other things. And we will be studying the Ming Dynasty in our next unit. And within that, we'll see when silver becomes a big item on the market, China's role in pushing the silver trade as well, right? So all sorts of trade. Also culturally, there's an extreme emphasis on restoring Chinese culture and celebrating it to no end. So one way to do that is by banning all things Mongolian. So you weren't allowed to speak any Mongolian language. You couldn't name your child a Mongolian name. All their dress and all their other customs were fully banned, right? So get all things Mongolian out of China, and uplift all things Chinese. And I think one of the best examples of that, and albeit kind of a nerdy one, is the Yongle Encyclopedia, which under an Emperor Yongle, his whole goal was to compile every major Chinese literary work ever written, which is a really ambitious task considering that China has the longest history of literature. Other civilizations might have been writing for longer, but they were generally writing for utilitarian purposes like taxation, laws, and things of that nature. But China has been writing for very literary purposes longer than any other civilization. So while this task isn't fully completed, it's showing you the energy of this time period and the way in which they value and celebrate their culture. So that's a good example of that. And the Forbidden City also is a show of the new empire, right? That this new dynasty is here, and so they're making their new mark. But also, it's a big, beautiful, amazing building, so it's another show of pride. And obviously, it's called the Forbidden City because only the imperial family and the most upper echelon of mandarins would have been allowed within it. Otherwise, it was forbidden for the average Chinese citizen. So here are some of my own travel pics to the Forbidden City. It really is an impressive site. So looking at kind of the details, very kind of brightly colored, super beautiful. And as we will learn, one of the first things Mao Zedong does when the communists take over China is open up the Forbidden City to the public, right? Kind of breaking that barrier between the government and the people. That's why his, big portrait is now on the entrance of it, and obviously why people can go and visit. And these are just cute kids who are on a field trip, if you can imagine going on a field trip to the Forbidden City. Pretty cool. So for the Forbidden City not only is a show of the power of the Ming Dynasty, it's also a show of the continuity of Taoism, right? So first and foremost, the way the Forbidden City works is that you're only allowed in, right, if you're one of the people I mentioned before. But even once you get in, you're only allowed so far into the Forbidden City depending on your rank. So the lowest ranked people would only have been allowed to be at the Gate of Supreme Harmony to hear maybe the emperor speak, and allowed in the first level of the Forbidden City. And then if you are higher ranked, you can go further and further in. So again, it's a show of kind of rank and honoring those who are higher up than others. But also, as I said, this is a show of Taoism, because if you notice, there is a great deal of symmetry, right? And Taoism is all about balance. And not only is there this kind of feng shui type symmetry happening, but we see even what, like the business that would have been held within the Forbidden City balances itself out. So on the one side, as you'll see, is the Hall of Military Eminences, right, where they celebrate all things military. But then opposite to that is the Hall of Literary Glory, right? So we have the brains on one side, we have the brawn on the other. The women of the family would live on one side, right? So the Palace of Motherly Tranquility, so all the women of the imperial family would take residence here, and the men would take residence on the other side, keeping that constant balance. So we haven't talked about Taoism in a while. It is truly infused into Chinese culture, not something that they always need to separate out and celebrate. It's just kind of part and parcel of most of the things that they do, which includes the Forbidden City. So just a couple of views of what it looks like from the modern day. You can see all the smog in Beijing right here, but so yeah, lots of symmetry, lots of Taoist elements there, and also very rich. So anywhere you look, the details of it show just the might, the power, and the opulence of the Ming. We have kind of these canals coming through, which would have been used for utilitarian purposes, but also anytime you control water, that's a show of power. So there's that. We can also see guardians here, which again are kind of part of Taoism, right? So on the edges of all the kind of pagoda-style roofs, we have guardians to protect the families. This is one of the main throne rooms, so it's just kind of gold gilded everything. And up here as well is another Ming and Qing era ceiling. Whenever you go into a Chinese temple or building, look up. The ceilings are usually the most impressive part of that building. So at the top, we see a few things. And also this this portion of the ceiling here, it's kind of hard to see, but there's a dragon in the center with 5 claws. And a 5-clawed dragon is an imperial dragon. So just kind of showing a couple of details there, but ultimately super rich. And one of the ways they also showed off just how rich and powerful they were was through their Imperial Garden. So as I was walking through the Forbidden City, I expected the Imperial Garden to be similar to other major gardens I've been to, which would be filled with, flora and fauna and all these amazing trees and flowers, probably exotic ones from all parts of the world. But the main event in the Forbidden City's Imperial Garden are actually these huge rock formations. So you can see all these big rocks here, these big rocks there. So they found rocks to have a natural beauty, but also why they like them is it could show the power that they had. And by this I mean that these rocks are not local. In fact, this is like one solid rock, and I forget how much I read before, how much it weighs, but it weighed a lot, all those parts. And they recently discovered that they imported that rock from like 20 or 30 miles away. And since they have the labor to do that, right, they're showing off that they have that power. And it's believed that they transported that rock during the wintertime, that they waited for it to be freezing, and they flooded this whole neighborhood behind the Forbidden City so that they could slide that rock over the ice into the Forbidden City's garden. So it's just a show, again, of might and force and power, and a very different take on a garden. And also as a reminder of what our Ming Era pottery looks like. It's our blue and white pottery, as we see here. This would have been for more domestic use, as it has Chinese motifs on it. Something like this would be more for European consumption, as it has a lot of grapes and leaves and things of that nature. So they have both domestic and international markets that they were serving with their blue and white Ming porcelain. And our other big change in the Ming era is that as much as they had a smaller seafaring culture, right, the thing about China is they generally sat back and let people come to them because people always would, right? Everybody wants to trade with China. But in the Ming era, in this age of extreme nationalism, they went beyond their borders and began to trade within the Indian Ocean basin. It's also believed that they might have attempted to cross the Pacific. And there is evidence that the Chinese reached like northern California, but didn't stay there because there was no significant populations to trade with and get rich with. And this all laid on the shoulders of Zheng He, who was the admiral of the Ming Navy. He's a pretty interesting figure. He is a Muslim, so he would have been from far western China, and he was obviously eunuch as a if you were going to put anybody in charge of the military in this time period, they better not be able to have a family, right? Because they could easily overthrow the government. And he leads several massive naval expeditions. And he's so important because as he led these naval expeditions, not only does he continue, right, to spread the fame and fortunes of China, but through his diplomatic means, he gains many more kind of friends for China and spreads his own fame across the Indian Ocean and whatnot. In fact, wherever he went, he would bring all these gifts as an ambassador of the Chinese government, but he would also fund the building of any type of temple, like whatever they had worshipped. So he funded the building of Buddhist temples and Muslim mosques and Hindu shrines and temples, etc. So he was super strong militaristically and would defeat all these pirates and other groups, right? But everybody loved him. In fact, if you travel around the Indian Ocean, there are many, mosques and other temples named after him, schools as well. And so his voyages will cover this huge territory. I'm going to just go ahead and show you some of the maps right here. So these are his various voyages that go all around Indonesia. And this is very important. They spend a lot of time trading and interacting with Indonesia. And it's believed that the massive spike of Muslim conversion is very much linked to Zheng He and his men and the time they would spend there, the number of mosques that they patroned, and possibly the people who stayed behind. And today, Indonesia is not only the largest Muslim population, but also the fastest growing, right? So this has a huge long-term effect. We see they also went to India, went to the Arabian Peninsula, and also went to East Africa. This is one of the more famous images coming from the travels of Zheng He. And this, or the next image I show you, is almost always on the AP exam in some way or another, just kind of talking about cross-cultural interactions or this very impressive age of Chinese naval history. And what this is documenting the gift that an East African king gave to Zheng He. So Zheng He brought probably silk and porcelains and other amazing Chinese gifts and gave that to some East African leader. An East African leader gave him a giraffe. And so it's kind of unique looking at the Chinese characters up here. Here they have this East African animal. And of course the question is, well, how do you get a giraffe home on these boats? And they were able to do that because Zheng He's boats were huge. They were known as treasure junks. And this is an image that, as I said, is often on the AP exam, which juxtaposes the size of European ships. And this is the size of a galleon or caravel that Columbus would have used in his voyages, and a lot of other Europeans use this type of ship. These are the treasure junks. So there are multiple of these massive boats that Zheng He would have led, and in those expeditions, he would have had dozens of other smaller boats alongside with them. So on these huge boats, not only are they rolling into port and they're already an impressive and probably pretty frightening image, but they were able to bring more goods back and forth with them. These voyages did end at some point in the mid-1400s, and there are many reasons for this. One has to do with steppe nomads acting up again in the north, and so it was seen as kind of unnecessary to be spending the money on these voyages since they never needed to do them before, so they stopped that and diverted their monies to the north of China. Other financial stresses as well, but it's also believed that the emperor was a little jealous of Zheng He, right? That people were naming the temples and these schools and other buildings and sometimes islands after Zheng He and not the emperor. So, and a reason that people put a lot of stock in that theory is that they didn't just end those voyages, they actually destroyed these ships and sunk them, right? So what's the point of that? That seems a little vengeful. So might have been a little jealousy on the part of the Chinese emperor. So let's talk briefly about the European Renaissance. Because even though these things are happening for the similar reasons at the same time, there's a key difference between this Renaissance period in Europe and the Renaissance period in China. The big thing has to do with the fact that both of them are going to be going through a rebirth period of kind of classic culture. But politically for China, this will result in a continuity, right? They'll rebuild their empire and they'll be united under one ruler, as they always have been. Whereas in Europe, this Renaissance does not lead to a political renaissance in terms of rebuilding the Roman Empire by any means. Instead, we are continuing the development of these regional states. So this is a renaissance of ideas, an economy, an art, but not necessarily a political one, right? Rebirthing the Roman Empire. But instead, as I said, is this transformational age. And all the things listed on this slide is what we can expect. In fact, we're only going to briefly talk about this because the parts of the Renaissance that matter most to this course, including the age of exploration and the Protestant Reformation, take part more in the 15 and 1600s. So we'll focus more on that stuff later, but we'll do a brief intro so we can get a sense of how these are similar Renaissance type periods. Right. So as I said, we won't see empire in Europe necessarily, but instead, post-plague, we're seeing the slow development of those regional states, which in the last video, we mentioned that for Europe, this is good in the long term because each one of these states will be competing with a very close neighbor, and via that competition, they'll be motivated to really keep up with their weapons technology and craft technologies, and also to get out into the seas and create colonies or their trade networks. So this competition with neighbors will lead to major advancements in Europe and ultimately to the rise of Europe as a superpower region, right? But we're not becoming this empire as China is going through at that time period. And also a reminder that the Renaissance is born of the plague in many ways, right? That the feudal system is challenged by the fact that so many people are killed and we can no longer keep people necessarily as serfs. Some people will suffer as serf-like people for a long period of time. We'll see that the French Revolution has a lot of feudal causes to it. But as we free some people of their serfdom via the plague, we see the slow rise of a middle class, which is further helped along right by these competitive regional states. And this will kind of lead to this kind of dawning of a new age in this next time period. But as I said, if we think of the Renaissance, and I'm not going to get too into this, I'm actually going to let Crash Course do a little better job of this. But if we think of the Renaissance, we always think of the art. And so this is further proof that this is a Renaissance of ideas, not necessarily a political Renaissance. One of my favorite examples to show the Renaissance ideals coming through in the art is Botticelli. And Botticelli's works of Primavera and the Birth of Venus, but we'll focus primarily on Primavera here, show this blending of classical ideologies like Greek and Roman gods and goddesses and paganism with Christianity. Right? Even though we're going to celebrate Greek and Roman ideas and logic and science and stuff, Christianity is obviously not going away. So they're going to coexist in really interesting, although sometimes difficult ways. So here in this Botticelli painting called Primavera, which means springtime, we see a lot of pagan imagery, right? So we see a Cupid type figure. We see all these like naked type images and people dancing around like a May Day festival, which is very pagan. We see this image here, looks kind of like a devil, but it's also kind of like winter, kind of grabbing on and holding on as it's eventually dismissed. In the midst of this, we see this figure who's very much like a Madonna figure, right? The Virgin Mary in the midst of it. So it's blending the imagery of Greece, of Rome, with new Christian imagery in this kind of dawning of a Renaissance period. Also, Leonardo da Vinci is a great example, right? He was funded by the church. So as much as some parts of Renaissance culture is going to challenge the church, some of Renaissance culture is upheld by the church. And Da Vinci will do a lot of things that are considered very secular. He will challenge the church with his scientific investigations, but also he's one of the great Christian painters in a way, even if he himself was tortured, right, with the ideas of faith. And of course, The Last Supper is one of the great Renaissance paintings funded by the church. Thus, we see a continuity of Christian imagery. And the last thing we'll talk about is a concept of humanism. And humanism is a philosophical and literary tradition that rises in the early Renaissance period. And the whole humanist movement is one that is affected by the rebirth of Greek thinking, right? It'll emphasize reason, scientific inquiry, and really celebrate the human, right? The individual, and push for them to explore their boundaries and their limits and contribute to the world and not be so insular as was happening in the medieval period, and also to balance faith with secular learning. Some humanists will reject faith in Christianity altogether, but most of them are trying to find this balance with investigation of the scientific world and embracing their Christian faith. There are a lot of humanist books that will be written. I'll introduce you to two of the main authors of this time period, but a big enabler of the spread of all of this is the printing press, which the technologies of the printing press make their way to Europe via the Silk Roads and Mongol expansion and all of that. But Gutenberg in the Holy Roman Empire will create a European version of the printing press. in 1436, and via this we can spread all these ideas more rapidly. So the two humanist writers that I want you to know are Petrarch and Erasmus. First, Petrarch, he's considered the father of humanism because he helped to translate a lot of ancient Greek and Roman writings and really revived the interest in classical literature, and through this encouraged even more intellectuals to engage in Greek science and logic and challenge the old medieval worldview, right? So they can open up their fields of learning. And Erasmus is also very important because he himself investigated the New Testament and wrote new versions of it. So he was a Christian. So when he writes an essay called The Praise of Folly, he's not going to be criticizing Christianity, but instead he's criticizing the Catholic Church and the Pope and calling them corrupt, believing that they have stopped teaching from the Bible itself, but instead become this corrupt institution that has ruined Christianity. And the effect of this is essentially the Protestant Reformation, which we'll study in the next unit, which is a huge cultural movement that will have major political ramifications, right? So he's opening the way for that. And the last part, which we're going to spend more time on in the next unit, is that age of exploration, which you remember when you were young, dressing up like explorers and stuff like that. But this is all part and parcel, right? We're interested in the outside world. We've economically recovered. We demographically have recovered. And we're competing with neighbors so that we can get the best trade routes and colonies, etc. Okay? So we'll leave that here for now and explore some of this in the next unit.